Hey. All right, so I want to start by saying that lately I feel like I don't know what I'm talking about. And I don't know, I might say. I don't know. And I'm not like Socrates or something that said, it was said of him, or I think he said of himself, I know that I don't know, and that's what makes me wise, or something like that. I just don't know. And it's not like I always feel this way. Sometimes I don't really stay in this not knowing, and I have like a sudden burst of energy, like a sudden burst of knowing. And I proclaim this quite loudly, convincing myself or someone else that I know what I'm talking about. And this is a particular curse of preachers. I come from a long line of preachers, by the way, as far back as I can see. And we all have this disease of sounding like we know what we talk, sounding like we know what we're talking about, even when we don't. Yeah, so I'm just kind of in that mood. That's what I want to start off by letting you know my current mood. I don't really know, and here are things that I've said in the last couple years. Well, it's not like Trump is going to actually be elected. That was one thing I said. I said that quite convincingly, and people were like, that's right. Yeah, thanks for, you obviously know. Or I said things like, it's not like Roe will ever be overturned. Or I said things like, it's not like COVID is going to last. And here's a recent one. It's not like gas is going to be $8. I was just in L.A., the great Los Angeles. Gas was $8.50. Yeah. I went to the farmer's market with my friend, and eggs were $14 a dozen. Oh, that was at the farmer's market. I just want to emphasize that. No, I was in Hollywood, so that might explain some things. But what's my point? I don't know what I'm talking about. That's my main point. I really don't know what I'm talking about. And I'm not sure really what America is anymore. I don't know what kind of country we live in. I don't even know what kind of country I'd like. I don't even know if my preferences really matter all that much. Right now we're obsessed with our preferences, that's for sure. I made a long list of things I don't know, so I'm making sure I catch just a few of them. I don't know how to love my neighbor, even though part of me says, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think Jesus knew what he was talking about. That's actually from Leviticus, by the way. So even older. Yeah, but I don't really know my neighbors. So that makes it more problematic. And I don't really want to know them, to tell you the truth, at least some of them. I don't know who to believe. I regularly have this feeling, like I don't really know who to believe, or I don't even know where to look for things that are worth believing. Sometimes I have that feeling, like where would I even start? Take anything at all, any issue, cause, purpose, fact. Where do I even start if I feel that uprising of, I'm not sure who to trust? And here's something that, this is maybe more of a claim, but it does seem there's some truth here, that all of the rage and grief and protesting and marching and Facebook posting, especially the Facebook posting, what has it done? I don't know. I really don't know. Like, what does work? Like old-fashioned democracy that is very, very slow. Who has time for that? It doesn't fit on a meme, It doesn't fit on TikTok. It's not 10 seconds, it's not 144 characters. So ain't nobody got time for that. Something like that. Here, just a few more things I don't know. I don't know if we should be flying to outer space. It's just like a curiosity I have. Like, I don't know if that seems like a good idea, really. Plus, it seems like it costs a lot of money. I don't know if electric cars are going to save us from CO2 emissions, because you do have to plug them in after all. Here's something, I don't know if corporations are ever going to tell us the truth about anything. So pretty much that means every single thing we read and encounter, we can be pretty sure they're not going to tell us the truth about anything. But corporations are persons, so says the Supreme Court, so we have to honor and respect them and treat them with dignity. Here's something, I don't know if I can ever call myself a Democrat or a Republican. Really, I don't know if I can ever do that with a straight face. Thanks, David. Or a gay face. You know, because I see so much hypocrisy or corruption or half-truths, and I see that in myself. I am a hypocrite. You know? I'm full of half-truths. Well, I'm not very many truths at all. Quarter. 1/8. What's even worse than that? I was really bad at fractions. Really, really, really bad at fractions, along with math in general. Okay, here's something that does seem true, even though I'm beginning by saying I don't know what I'm talking about. But the ideological two-sided binary choice that seems to be coloring everything doesn't appear to be working very well. And everything is getting turned into who's for me and who's against me. Who's for me, who's against me. Who's for me, who's against me. Who's in and who's out. Who's in and who's out. And another word for that is fundamentalism. And I know fundamentalism. I know a certain version of fundamentalism. A certain version of evangelical Christian Baptist fundamentalism. And there's a lot of good people in that as well. I mean, I'm not now turning them into the bad person. It's like you recognize it. Who's in and who's out is the major question. Who's in and who's out? And it seems like everything is just screaming. Who's in my camp and who's not in my camp, and who's in and who's out, and who has the right to be here and who doesn't have the right to be here. And this kind of circling of the wagons that happens doesn't seem to be very good for people in the long run. Doesn't seem to lead to questions of well-being, which is what I'm supposed to be talking about today. Mind, body, spirit, well-being. This kind of circling of the wagons leaves us fearful and hateful and kind of white-knuckled and tired and depressed and suicidal and hopeless and weary. And that describes a lot of people right now. So whenever I feel this sort of deeper not knowing, words typically are not the answer. And I don't really want to be speaking right now. I've had that feeling like in the last couple weeks, in fact. It's not more words. So I guess I'm just saying that out loud. I don't really want to be saying anything right now. It's like there's a time for silence, and I can feel that creeping in. Like, what happens if we consent to silence for a moment? You know, it is, I know I'm going to say something abstract, the space between things that makes things interesting. It's like, that's what makes a song. It's like the space between the notes that make a song. If it's one note, it's boring. And if that one note doesn't stop, you'll go insane. So, silence, of course, anytime something dramatic happens in this country, people immediately go into silence. Especially the news. They get a panel of experts and they just sit there in silence. Just feeling into the the numinosity of the great abyss of nothingness and emptiness and quiet. Yeah, so I just want to say that's the kind of place I'm in right now, and it's like I would like to listen more deeply. And if there are words that need to be spoken, it's sort of like what Leslie said in her poem, to speak more softly, you know. But it's it's also 10:30 on a Sunday morning at C3, and I'm supposed to be saying things. So here I am in front of all of you, and whom I love, and I've come armed yet again with a poem. All right? Yes. So the poem I want to muse a little bit on today is called The Second Music. And I want to use this poem to talk a bit about the soul, which is old-fashioned terrain, which I tend to like. And I want to give you some ways of thinking about the soul today and why it might matter and why it might matter now. So there's some typos in your version. You can blame that on me. I'm also bad at spelling. So math and spelling. You wonder how I ever went to graduate school, for that matter. Okay, so here's a poem by Annie Lightheart, called The Second Music. Now I understand there are two melodies playing. Now I understand there are two melodies playing, one below the other. One easier to hear, the other lower, steady, perhaps more faithful for being less heard, yet always present. Like, what is the melody that's always present but less heard? And how would you hear such a melody? You probably need to be quiet, is my guess. When all other things seem lively and real, this one fades. When all other things seem lively and real, this one fades. Yet the notes of it touch gently as fingertips, as the sound of the names laid over each child at birth. I want to stay in that music without striving or cover. There's the first typo. I want to stay in that music without striving or cover. A kind of relaxation, kind of like what was in Leslie's poem. I want to stay in that music without striving or cover. If the truth of our lives is what is playing, in the music that is, if the truth of our lives is what it is playing, the telling so soft that this mortal time, this irrevocable change becomes beautiful. I stop and stop again to hear the second music. I hear the children in the yard. I hear the children in the yard. A train, then birds. All this is in it and will be gone. I set my ear to it as I would to a heart. Yeah. I'd like to listen in this way. I might even say that I have faith in the second music. That there is such a thing. That there's a thing beneath the thing. There's a melody beneath the melody. There's a soft, precious, beating heart inside every human face that I encounter, or mask that I encounter, or bullhorn that I encounter. And I think to have a relationship with the second music is in part what I might even mean by have a life of soul. Like when people say that music has no soul, it's like, what are they referring to? Music has no soul. Is that like a thing that you can just put in a song? Well, it's kind of like saying inside that song there's a second music. I know I'm speaking metaphorically here, but we were joking in the pre-talk thing. I said, I bet no one, certain kinds no one has ever entered an elevator with that music and just fallen to their knees weeping in ecstasy and joy and oblivion and depth and said, this is what I want at my funeral. You may disagree. So what is that depth dimension, or the second music, we might say, that connects us more deeply to what's real? Because that's what she's saying in this poem. She's saying that the truth of our lives, just what's ordinary and plain, is the thing that's playing. So what do I want to say? I want to say that for me, when I'm in this state of not knowing, what starts to awaken is what I might call a kind of craving, a kind of longing even, or an ache, even a kind of loneliness right at the center of my chest that kind of moves out into my body. It's a craving, it's a longing, it's a loneliness. And in a way, I'm hungry for the second music. And I sometimes get hungrier when I come across billboards or advertisements or cultural things that make promises. The ache gets bigger, is what I'm saying. I don't think, you know what? What I'm missing is this pharmaceutical. That's what it was all along. This drug, that's what it was. I'm just like high school. Drugs will fix things. No, the ache, the longing, the loneliness, the craving, even for the second music, just starts to grow. And my ears starts to get attuned for things beneath the thing, or beneath the din. You know, what's that line from David White? Forget the news, forget the blurred screen. One good word is bread for 1,000. You know, I get hungry for that. One good word is bread for 1,000. And I thought it was such an interesting way to begin the morning with Leslie's meditation. She was saying, I'm hurting, I'm in pain, or I'm suffering. There's some grief present, and I want to begin with a poem. Yeah, that's right. That's the one good word that's bread for 1,000. That's the ache. The ache is for that kind of depth. So, that was my intro to the thing that I wanted to talk about, which was what I'm calling a second look at the soul. So usually, or every once in a while, I have this feeling that we should take a moratorium on words like spirit, soul, and God, because we often don't know what we mean by these things. Or sometimes two people are talking about, say, God or soul, and they're not actually talking to each other. They have completely different definitions of the thing that they're talking about. So it's like two ships passing in the night, you know? It's like not much happening there. It might feel very lively and argumentative, but we're not operating on the same ground. But I can't help it. I can't help using words like God or spirit or soul, because they're pointers. They're words that we have been in relationship with for a very long time. And they're pointers. They point beyond themselves. You could say all words point beyond themselves. That's true. But I don't want to go down that linguistic rabbit hole right this second. But especially words like God and soul. It's like things we don't know how to name. Like, I'll just take the two poles for a moment. God, at least for me, tends to point to the whole, or reality with a capital R. It's the cosmos, the fluid of everything that we are in and a part of. It's to touch upon that landscape, is to experience a kind of transcendence. And so we use words like God to point to that. And the soul, I think, is in some ways the opposite side of that coin, and it has to do with our our essence as individuals. It's not just a whole, but there's also, like, you are just wildly you. I know that because I've talked to you, and you're just kind of weird and unique, and that's kind of amazing. And soul is one of the many words we use for that kind of what essence that makes you you. And those are really broad categories, obviously. And it's not that I know what these words mean. That's my point. They kind of point beyond themselves. They point to the music, we could say. Like the music of who you are as a person is kind of what I mean by soul. And in fact, I might even just add one little detail here. It might be that the words themselves don't actually mean anything. But in using them, they describe a relationship that's meaningful. I'll give you an example. Like, you ever seen those books that are, this is a bit of a strange example, but you ever seen those books that are like arguments for the existence of God, or some version of that? Like, God exists, and here are 5 points. And of course, everyone who reads that is convinced, and they're like, oh, I guess we're done with that. But what's interesting about that frame is that we're saying things like, well, God must exist because I exist and you exist, and I'm going to prove that you exist and I exist, and I'm going to prove that God exists in the same way because God must be a thing that exists, we could say. God is a thing that exists, and I'm just going to get to it, and there it is. And here are some arguments to help you do that. But what I'm saying is something like, a word like God is used for things that don't exist. You could say the greatest argument for the existence of God is that God doesn't exist. I mean, if God existed like a thing existed, like this microphone, then how would that be God? It would just be one more thing. So I know I'm getting kind of like loopy here, but what am I saying? I'm saying the greatest proof for the existence of God is that God doesn't exist. And that God is the word we use to point to that kind of emptiness. And we need symbols and images and metaphors to help us get close to relate to that kind of emptiness. That kind of non-existence. We relate to it in some way. I have a relationship with that, we could say. And I would say something is also true of the soul. And I'm going to try to say a few things about it. So I've been interested in what I would call soul work for a few years. And I've been wrestling with different kinds of definitions. I've used different definitions here. Different images and metaphors. Because that's all we have when we get down on this layer of where language itself has its limitations. Now, in Greek, you should know that the Greek word for soul is psyche. And there's this great myth of Psyche and Eros. Sometime I'll tell it to you, or versions of it to you here. But Psyche is the word. That already sort of changes things anyway for me. That's where it comes from. Psyche is connected to the image of the butterfly, by the way. So just think about that. What were the Greeks saying? Like, they're saying each person is like a butterfly. And when you say butterfly, you also have to acknowledge the complex life cycle of a butterfly, right? It's like, how did that thing get to be a thing? It's almost like it was born and then born again. You know? And they were saying the human essence the essence of a human is something like that. It's like we're born, but then we also have these potentialities. And it's like we can be born again. The psyche is that mysterious. The soul is that mysterious, you could say. And you've probably met people who have a fair amount of soul. Wouldn't you agree? Even if we don't even know if we use definitions. It's like their essence is shimmering in some way. And the Greeks called that psyche. This is, by the way, probably something that all religions seem to have in common. They might use different definitions of soul, but what they have in common is that humans can be born twice, at least in some way. I mean, you hear it in Christianity, you must be born again, that kind of thing. But it's also some version of that exists in most spiritualities, that you come into this world and you can also be transformed. Isn't that interesting? How would people come up with that unless it's true in some way? Anyway, that's just an aside. I guess I want to ask you, do you believe in the soul? And if so, what do you mean by such a thing? Is there an essence or a kind of possibility that is deeper than your surface life or your resume or your history? Wouldn't it be great on your tombstone if you put your resume? Just still looking for a job out there, I mean, like, what? It's just like, or if you put the exact information that's on your Facebook profile right now, I mean, that's your tombstone. There it is. Like, I don't know. That doesn't seem right. Why doesn't that seem right? Because there is an essence, I would say, or a core or a soul of you that's beneath that. And I believe in that. I trust that. And that's also partly what we mean, at least what I mean, with phrases like people who are, quote, doing their work. What are they doing their work with? Well, they're sinking beneath the surface roles and identities and that kind of stuff. It is a fun game, by the way. It's a fun game I play sometimes. Like things I would put on my tombstone. I have a very dark sense of humor. Like, here's one. He worked out a lot. I just think that would be great. He worked out a lot. Kent Dobson, 1976 to whenever. He worked out a lot. You should come up with some on your own, Well, he never really looked. I just think that would be funny. That's the tombstone. He avoided. That'd also be a good one. He managed to hide the truth from himself. 1976. I could go on and on. That's your lunchtime conversation. All right. Okay, here's an image. I'm going to get right to my point here. I want to give you an image of the soul that you can play with today and maybe forever if it rings true for you or something like that. And it came out of an experience I had. And so here's the experience. One time I was in the desert, and it was in February. It was the wintertime, and I was laying down in the desert at night, and the stars were out. I don't remember seeing the moon, so it was quite dark. And it was the kind of night where it's actually a bit hard to make out constellations because the stars are that bright. And that's getting rarer in the world at this point. But sometimes the night sky is like that. And it can kind of pin you to the earth in a way. And there I was laying there. And I don't really know much about constellations. Like, no one ever explained them to me. I was a Baptist kid, zodiac, voodoo, avoid things. Greek names in the sky sounds like demons to me, So I didn't grow up around knowing the constellations other than the Big Dipper. That was allowed. What's a dipper? You dip things with it. It points north. That one's okay, Orion's belt now. Ooh, wait a minute. But I was lying there, and I noticed Orion's belt. I was like, oh, there it is. There's the belt. And that was kind of a thought, but not that, it wasn't like some great revelation. It was like, oh, there it is. And I just was laying there, and who knows what I was doing. I think I was doing nothing. I was doing good old-fashioned nothing and just being quiet. And after a while, I started to notice the arc of Orion's bow. It's like, there, he's holding a bow. There it is. And I was kind of just like, I see how it works now. People were bored, and they just laid around. And sure enough, the night sky started forming these. Well, the night sky wasn't doing anything. The human mind, the human psyche was being in relationship with the night sky in a certain kind of way. And after a while, I started to see the animal that he was shooting. I was like, I didn't even know he was shooting it. I didn't even know he had a bow, for that matter. And I could see the heart of that animal, which is the 7 sisters, I later found out. It's like, oh my God. And I started to wonder, in the wake of this experience, what we mean by the soul. And here's what I'd like to say about it. Here's an image or a possible metaphor. That the soul is like a constellation. You are constellated in a certain way. Some of it you're aware of, points of the constellation. Some of it you're not that aware of. You're still constellated in a certain way. And that having a relationship with your own soul is like coming to know the constellation. And it takes a long time. You have to lie down there on the earth and be quiet and still for a very long time. And so here are the points of the constellation. Here are examples. Your wounds. Sure enough, that's one of the stars, your wounds. How many of you are not wounded? I mean, oh, I'm not wounded. I'm fine. It's a wound. And you know what is just on the other side of that wound? A certain kind of sensitivity. Only you are wounded, and only you have a certain kind of sensitivity to be wounded in that way. And what else is part of the constellation? I don't know. Your DNA, your family history, big dreams for me, dreams, the kind you have at night, not like, I want to be an astronaut and go with Elon Musk. Not that kind of dream. I mean the kind you have at night, dreams or mysterious encounters, or if you have kids, like the moment a child is born, or like what's in this poem, the naming of a child. It's like, that's a point in the constellation, I would say. And you are uniquely constellated the way you are constellated. And one of the problems we have right now in sort of American Western culture is that we think we must be one thing. Like we must be one blazing star. And that's our identity. And I just know that I'm this. Meanwhile, there's a whole hidden constellation behind the scenes here. That's really the thing that's at work. So I'm just offering this to you as an image. What do we mean by someone's essence? What do we mean by soul? Well, one way of imagining it is that you're kind of like a constellation. And it takes a long time for you to even recognize what the constellation looks like. And here's where things get more interesting, at least to me. What makes a constellation a constellation? It is the relationship between things. It's the resonance between points. Just like Orion's belt and bow and arrow and hunting scene, what makes that a scene is the relationship between those stars, even the resonance between those stars. And that's partly what makes you uniquely you. It's like a tuning fork. One star is on one side of the tuning fork, and on the other side of the tuning fork is another star, or something like that. Now I'm mixing metaphors, I realize. And you have a certain resonance, and you relate to the world. It's like saying we are a bundle of relationships. That's my point here. That's partly what we mean by the psyche. The psyche is a complex bundle of relationships. That's what makes you you. And how those points, even your own stories, how do they relate to one another? That's partly what makes you you. And one of the things I think that if we're going to make it to the 22nd century, when we look at our neighbors and friends and enemies, and if we fail to see them as a complex constellation of resonances, we're a lot more likely to treat them as just objects or things that are disposable, or who's in and who's out, in other words. So I think, like the title of the talk, it's time for a second look at the soul. And what I'm offering is that who you are in your essence is a complex set of relationships. That's also scientific. That is actually physically the case. One of the lies, I was going to say lies, I'll back off and say, one of the illusions that we have about science is that science will eventually find everything to be a thing. Do you know what the most complex science is saying right now about consciousness? It's going to sound like what I said about God, that it doesn't exist. They are not going to find a bundle of neurons somewhere in your brain and say, there is consciousness. You know what they're saying consciousness is? It's a, quote, complex set of relationships. That's the soul. We are who we are in relationship to everything else, including chemicals and hormones and neural grooves. And by the way, you know what a neural groove is? It's like why people repeat themselves, you know, like why I repeat myself. I'm stuck in a neural groove. I just think that's funny. Patterns. But we are who we are in relationship to everything else, and you are a wildly unique constellation of relationships. And the way to deepen a soul life is to deepen the relationship you have with the points of the constellation, which takes time and silence and quiet and investigation and conversation and relationship. And not only that, I'll make the metaphor even more complex, I guess, which is not only are you a complex set of relationships, the constellation, you're embedded in the night sky. You're embedded in the world, which is a complex set of relationships. And you are who you are in relationship to everything else. So what's this mean? It's not really about me, after all. It's not really about me. I don't even know what me is. You know, it's like a certain amount of humility and relaxation about what is my own nature and how am I constellated and what resonates? What's the relationship between the points of who I am? What is that relationship? And okay, here's something that's probably true, and then I'm almost done here. You probably know people who have a deeper sense of the way they're constellated. Like, when they show up, they kind of know who they are. And the way they're constellated has a certain effect on the room. Do you know people like this? They have soul in that sense. You probably also know people who don't know that very much, or they don't know very much about the way they're constellated. And what's it like to be around them? It's uncomfortable. They're just burnt. One star is burning, something like that. Or they're particularly attached to that one star. Okay, here's my final point. All I wanted to do is say today, I don't really know what I'm talking about. I still think it's worth talking about the soul. And I wanted to offer a simple image that maybe one way of looking at the soul is kind of like a constellation. And that constellation is embedded in a complex set of relationships. And so what is the path to soul, I don't know, to a deeper relationship with life? How shall we live in this kind of like lovely and terrible web of entanglement? I'm going to suggest listen for the second music. Listen for the second music. Really, really listen to the second music. What did Leslie say? Listen to people. Because you are a complex set of relationships. You are a complex set of relationship to yourself, and you're in an entanglement. Listen to people. Take time for stories. Listen for the unspoken thought. I'm quoting all these things that came right from the poem. That's listening to the second music. All the puffed up rhetoric and finger pointing and shaming, listen. Listen for the heartbeat, someone near you, even your neighbor, for God's sake. Now I understand that there are two melodies playing, one below the other. One is easier to hear. The other, lower, steady, perhaps more faithful for being less heard, yet always present. When all other things seem lively and real, this one fades. Yet the notes of it touch gently as fingertips, as the sound of names laid over each child at birth. I want to stay in that music. without striving or cover. If the truth of our lives is what is playing, but telling so soft that this mortal time, this irrevocable change becomes beautiful, I stop and stop again to hear the second music. I hear the children in the yard, a train, then birds, and all this is in it and will be gone. I set my ear to it as I would to a heart. Thanks.